I think it's something like they win 90-something% of games with him in the starting lineup, yet they win something like 60-something% of games if he's not in the starting lineup.
If one major player is out, whatever their role is, it's up to someone else to try and come in and step into that role. Now, it's not always easy.
Balancing a team for me is always crucial. The ingredients that make a good team are always very, very different.
Well, we all know what the answer is when you lose one of those players to injury. Blame the performance team, because they must have done something wrong.
The fans hear the news and they'll suddenly think, you can hear fans all around the country, can't you, going, that's our season over. That's it, that's done. Yeah. Roy Keane said something recently that said, good teams, I think coaches hold players accountable. He said, great teams, the players hold the players accountable. There's a lot of pressure on those players to have to be the very best they can be every day, because they influence so many other things other than their own performance. I always ask the same question. What are we going to do if he's injured?
Welcome, football fans, to Breaking Lines, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the beautiful game like never before. I'm Gary Rowett, former player and manager, joined by the insightful Dave Carolan, a man with his finger on the pulse of football's beating heart. Together, Dave and I bring you unrivaled insight, context, and a few stories from the trenches. This is Breaking Lines, where the game is more than just a match.
Well, Gary, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, as Mike Tyson famously said. And the same is true when you lose a talismanic player from your team. How does it affect you as a head coach when that happens?
Well, I've been pretty punch drunk a few times, Dave, I've got to be honest, because there's nothing worse than that feeling that, you set your team up, you set your squad up, you build around, you do build your squad around certain individuals. I don't care what any manager says. You get some players that just feel slightly different to the others. And obviously that's what a good squad's built of. And there's nothing worse than you see that player going down injured, maybe pre-season. We've had it before where a player's gone down pre-season and you've got to think, God, I might have to go 10 weeks without my main player. Do you know what I mean? And that really does. Yes, you should build a squad that's capable of sustaining these moments. And yes, you have to find different ways to win games, but there's nothing like having all your players available. And when some of those key players are not available or not on the pitch, there is a little bit of panic. There is a feeling of, we are not going to be quite as strong. So yeah, I've got to be honest. That's not my favourite moment to happen in pre-season when you guys have done too much running with them, and their hamstrings are tight and then suddenly it pops and he's out for 3 months.
Yeah, well, yet again, performance and sports science will take the blame for all of these injuries, but there's certainly different ways to lose a talisman. And as you said there, injury is probably the key one, isn't it? And when you see those players, you're going to lose them for a long period of time, maybe 3 or 4 months through a major injury, then that's probably the worst situation, is it? As opposed to someone who just gets sent off or something like that, where you're going to use them for maybe 2, 3, 4 games.
Yeah, look, I think, if you lose one for a short period of time, then of course there's an opportunity for someone that's probably not been playing, not been in the team, absolutely chomping at the bit. And often, that short-term impact, you never feel that quite as much, do you? Let's say a division, let's look at the Premier League, 38 games. If you lose one of your star players for 3 games, worst case scenario for a suspension, that can be almost over in a week. You can be without them for a week and that's it. You haven't got the issue of, the player's not going to lose fitness. He's not going to lose a lot of form. It gives someone else a chance and it gives the team a chance to accommodate around it. And also, the big thing for me, and I think this is sometimes undervalued, isn't it? But, if you lose a talisman, someone, let's define a talisman, someone who, almost leads the team, in performance and in mentality and, just someone who's so important to that team, whether that's quality or whatever qualities that person brings to the group. And it's often if that player, let's say that player's out injured for that period of time you spoke about, let's say 10 games or 10 weeks or whatever that is, it's the rest of a team, isn't it? Sometimes it's a feeling amongst the rest of the players. It's, oh, that's it, we're screwed for 10 weeks. You know what I mean? It's that loss of confidence. It's that loss of knowing, or that knowing that your team isn't going to be effective, because that might be the player that your teammates look to when they need inspiration on the pitch. You know, whether that's a goal or a moment of genius or a moment of quality, or just simply someone who's going to step up and grab people metaphorically and guide them through the rest of the game. And I think that's undervalued. I think it's that feeling that the other players get is just important as, you know, the technicalities that Talisman can bring on the pitch.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right there, aren't there? There are different buckets of Talisman. You know, you've got those key players who lead, you know, the captain styles, the Vieiras and Keanes of old, who stood above the team as such. They knitted the whole thing together, didn't they? Just with their leadership skills. But then you have the other ones who are the role-specific leaders, like the top defender, who you know is just going to make sure that the defense is organized, the goal scorer who's going to pull you a goal out of nothing, or that creative player who kind of knits everything together for the rest of the team in terms of your game model and how you play. So there's different types of Talisman, and perhaps if you had to choose, is there one that is kind of more key to the team than another?
Yeah, I think I mean, I suppose it's very difficult. I suppose when you look at Talisman, I would see it as one that's that leader, that Roy Keane type of driver in the middle of your pitch, who's often your captain, who often, you know, gives the team instructions and direction on the pitch, not, you know, and is essentially your manager on the pitch. And then there's a player that's a quality, whether that's a number 10 or whether that's a number 9 mainly, who just makes the difference in terms of quality, whether that's goals or attacking output or just the ability to come up with something out of nothing. I think both are equally as important. It's very, very difficult, I think, to sort of separate which one is the most important. I think when you're talking about a game where goal scoring is vital, you know, for me, it always feels like you know, there's never one player that's so influential amongst the others, but often a player that can score. You've got a 20-goal striker that you've scored and invested in the summer window, and then suddenly early on in the season he's not available. You know, that probably has more impact on your team. You know, it has more impact psychologically on your team because, like we said before, you've got defenders who are now, if you concede a goal as a defender, now you're looking and going, well, how are we going to go and score 2 goals to win the game? And often that can have a really detrimental impact on your team. So I think if I had to choose one, you know, those creative players, those players that can affect a game in one moment are very difficult to find, aren't they? And that's, of course, why they tend to fetch the most money or cost the most money.
Well, that's probably one of the things with the Talismen, isn't it? Or Talis people, as I suppose, if I'm being correct, is that everyone in the market knows that they're hard to find and they're expensive when you try and go and get them. When you're building a squad, I suppose there's a case of, can you have too many of them as well? You know, certainly if you've developed some of your own that have come through your own system, or over the years you've collected a few. We certainly see it at some of the big clubs where you can have almost a challenge where you can have a number of players who are so key to the whole thing that they affect you know, almost the squad balance. Having all of them there, they're a whole leadership group in themselves, and taking a key one out of the team is obviously a challenge.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's, you know, would you see a Talisman and a Maverick as very different, you know, slightly different things? I think if you look at a Maverick, can give you talismanic properties, I think, within the team, but you, of course, don't want too many of those types of players. And the balance in a team for me is always crucial. The ingredients that make a good team are always very, very different. And, you know, often you don't want too many of the same type of player, whether that's too many leaders, you know, you don't want too many players that feel so important, and you don't want too many players that perhaps think their own way or think individually, but you probably need some of those in every single team. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? When you're trying to sort of cook up that recipe of what makes a good side, a good team that can perform over a long period of time, or a good squad. I would say nowadays is not just a team, is it? But you have to have a mindset of what do we need there. But I think every manager also, when you're building your squad, or when you're sitting down with your sporting director and your head of recruitment and your coaching staff, and you're building the squad, I always ask the same question: what are we going to do if he's injured? What are we going to do? And you can almost go through the whole squad and go, right, what do we do if he's injured for a long period of time? You have to have the answers within that squad. Of course, that's very, very difficult to do, because most clubs you go to, you haven't got 2 or 3 20 goals a season strikers, of course. You might have one in there. So, it's a difficult balance.
Well, we all know what the answer is when you lose one of those players to injury. Blame the performance team, because they must have done something wrong. Someone's got to carry the can, so we'll stick our hand up again.
Dave, can we do an episode at some point, just for banter, and we can call it Blame the Performance Team? Can we? Or Blame the Medical Team? Well, you can do one. Blame the medical team. Let's do a few versions. As long as it's not blame the manager, the fans can do it. The fans do that often enough. So that should be a podcast title.
We leave you guys alone. Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right, aren't you? You need multiple type of leader styles kind of within your group, don't you? And exactly that. If one major player is out, whatever their role is, it's up to someone else to try and come in and step into that role. Now, it's not always easy, and we often find that some people are pushed into uncomfortable situations. As we said in the kind of captains episode we did previously, not everyone is ready to be that type of captain, and not everyone can step in and fill the boots of that talisman, because sometimes what they bring is bigger than just them in their shirt. They affect the whole morale of the team, and it's certainly something we've seen presented to us, where you lose that big player and you just feel the morale disappear from a training ground, don't you? Suddenly everybody just knows, wow, we're in for a tough time.
Yeah, I think when you have to break that news, or when somebody breaks the news to you as the manager that that your main player is out for 6 weeks or whatever that is, you just sat there and there's a little sinking feeling, isn't there, in that Monday morning meeting. And like we said, all eyes are on that physio when he has to give that bad news, or the medical head of medical. But that's a reality, and that's part of football. That's part of the process that we all have to go through, and you have to accept it. But like you say, when you then as a manager, you then have to go into the media, and you have to then say, although that's changing, isn't it, how long you're allowed to say people are out for, which I can let you explain a little bit more at some point, maybe, whether that's now or at another time. But it's a horrible feeling, isn't it? And then you've got to tell and then the fans hear the news, and they'll suddenly think, you can hear fans all around the country, can't you, going, oh, that's our season over. That's it, that's done. That's us out of the cup competition, or that's us not winning something, or whatever it is, because that one player sometimes gives everybody such hope. And such sort of confidence, and like you say, when you can lose that player, that bubble can be burst pretty quickly.
So there's probably no better example, and we are probably going to timestamp this episode with the example from this season when Rodri got injured from Man City. Everybody thought at the time, this looks serious, the way he went down with the injury, and then you find out, couple of days later, or by the end of the following week, that he's done his ACL, and it's practically a season-ending injury. And there's probably no player in the Premier League who's got stats attached to him like he does in how many games Man City don't win when he's not involved. He is literally the key player in their team almost that keeps them winning.
Well, when you're a defensive midfielder and you win the Ballon d'Or, I think there's a pretty good indication of how important that player is and how how that player knits together. So there's probably no greater modern day example of a talisman, certainly in the Premier League that we can talk about. And actually, it's right, isn't it? Even a club, that just shows you how difficult it is to replace. Because even a club like Man City with multi millions to spend on players and a squad depth and the ability to attract nearly any player to their football club, with the best manager, over a current period of time, the most decorated manager, and yet they still miss that player like it's a main player in a low-end championship team. It's exactly the same impact on the side. I mean, like you say, we're currently standing, Man City have lost 4 games on the spin. I think their stats are just something absolutely incredible, isn't it? I'm going to pluck them out the air now, and I don't know if you've actually got them, but I think it's something like they win 90-something% of games with him in the starting lineup, yet they win something like 60-something% of games if he's not in the starting lineup. So, the impact of someone like him on performances. And you're talking about someone like Kovacic, who comes in, who's an international player, who's a top quality Premier League footballer, but yet something just is missing from their team when he's not playing. And it's absolutely baffling, really, to think that one player at that level can make all the difference.
But maybe it's the effect on other teams as well as his effect on his own. Because certainly teams know when he's up against them, it fundamentally changes what they can do, because he's so comfortable on the ball, how he influences the rest of the team to be able to do whatever they want in front of them. But maybe, yes, having a Kovacic there, it's just not the same level of threat. It's just not the same level of team structure, maybe when Rodri isn't there than when you put anybody else in there. But we've also seen in more recent weeks, other teams in the Premier League start to lose key players. We're now a third of the way into the season. We're on to a third international break, and we're also seeing the likes of Arsenal lose Saka and Rice. You're seeing Liverpool lose Alisson Becker, their goalkeeper. But Liverpool haven't lost form. They've almost had a ready-made replacement who's come in and done just as well. But maybe is losing a goalkeeper less of a talismanic loss than it is if it's an outfield player like a Rodri or a Rice or a Saka?
Well, I think it has to be. I mean, if we just pivot back to the Man City one, it's interesting, wasn't it? Because when we spoke to Impact, we sort of went through that Wolves game plan against Man City, and actually the Wolves created quite a few different opportunities in transition, and we've seen a lot of teams do that against Man City in recent weeks, haven't we? Those transitions, they just look slightly more vulnerable. And again, like you say, sometimes it's not just on the ball, it's off the ball. It's that cohesion, it's that organisation, it's that, which you'd imagine from someone like Rodri as a defensive centre midfielder, but, he's just as important out of possession, filling gaps and filling space and seeing danger when he is in possession. I think, look, every team's going to have their own version of a talisman, aren't they? I think a goalkeeper's very different. Of course, we've seen it over the years at some of the top clubs that having a top goalkeeper impacts performance immeasurably. But I suppose it's the one area where it doesn't. I mean, it does affect the team. Of course, you see the build-up now involves the goalkeeper all the time. But just as a simple metric, the team can function without the goalkeeper in lots of different fashions. The goalkeeper has to, he has to make the saves. He has to make the blocks. Of course, he gives confidence to the defenders. But I suppose even a goalkeeper that's not as talismanic can still have an incredible performance, can't they? I mean, you look at Liverpool with Kelleher, very good in possession of the ball, and possibly even slightly more comfortable on the ball as Alisson, but capable in this period of time of making those saves as well. So I suppose it doesn't affect. Difficult for us to know how much that might affect them in the dressing room. Difficult for us to know how the leadership qualities of both those individuals. But I think everything Liverpool are doing at the moment just feels like it's seamless, doesn't it? It feels like they can lose a big name player, and it just maybe the manager has to almost fill that void when it comes to the confidence of the players. Maybe they haven't been allowed to lose confidence because the managers manage that situation so well. So yeah, I suppose there comes a time, doesn't there, where yes, you might lose a leader on the pitch and the team lose confidence, but also then there's a big question mark over the manager has to then make sure that doesn't happen, doesn't it? And that's a really big challenge, depending on the quality of that individual.
I suppose there's an argument there for the talismanic manager as well, isn't it? Like obviously Liverpool for 8-9 years had Klopp, and he was almost their talisman, where you certainly had important players on the pitch, didn't you? But it always felt a little bit with Liverpool that the talisman was on the sideline, and when he was there, it almost gave the rest of the team belief, no matter who was on the pitch. You could lose a Salah for a little period of time, or you could lose a Van Dijk maybe for a little bit of time, but it almost felt like Klopp maybe overrode that. But maybe with Guardiola in this situation with Rodri, there's just some players you just cannot take out of your team and expect the team just to function at the same way. I suppose it's the old phrase, to use another cliche, the sum of the parts and the whole being greater than that. I think taking this part out of Man City as a talismanic player that Rodri has diminished potentially them as a team.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Actually, you don't think about it in that way, but I would say probably losing talismanic managers has proved to be more problematic for some of the bigger clubs over the years as losing one player. I mean, if you think back to sort of Sir Alex Ferguson. So Alex Ferguson's reign is probably a very good example of what we're talking about, because there were times when a player felt so influential on the pitch. But as soon as that player perhaps became too influential, and obviously there were different reasons around it. Sir Alex Ferguson spoke publicly about it, that he would then just get rid of that player. If a player felt more important than the team, he would get rid of that player. So maybe actually relying on a talismanic player is the issue when you're talking about that top level. Maybe that's what you've got to try and get away from. But certainly a talismanic manager, the hole that leaves, has been felt more acutely, I suppose, over a long period of time. Like I said, you look at Liverpool's domination, and then losing that manager, it all falls apart. Man United has been exactly the same. Will we see that under Man City if Guardiola goes? Will we see that domination end? So it is I think it just shows that football's such a fine balance all the time, isn't it? You've got these talismanic players who, I've seen them. I've seen Derby County where Igor Stimac came into the Derby County team and Jim Smith managed him very different to everyone else. He had his own fitness coach pre-season. I don't know how much that cost him, but it seemed like a good deal, because he was jogging around the pitch while everyone else was absolutely going hammer and tongs at it. But Jim, you had to manage that talismanic player slightly differently. So it did cause problems in the dressing room. It did have a slight effect on the other players, but because that player performed so well, you kind of just accepted it. So there was a different way of doing that. But maybe the top managers won't allow somebody to become that powerful that you would feel that void when they're not available. It's such an interesting topic, isn't it? Because there's so many different angles on it and so many different ways that this talismanic player could be described, by us.
Well, that brings us on to an interesting side to it, isn't it? How to manage that talismanic player when suddenly they've come into the team, they've started to develop this reputation, probably at the start through their ability and how they affect the team when they join. But suddenly they stop believing that they are that important and they wanted to be treated differently. How does that start to present itself as a manager, or if you inherit one when you go into a club and you know that there's the odd senior player who just believes that they should be treated differently because they are that important to the team and everybody knows it, and maybe they start to have more of an effect on the manager than the manager has on them?
Yeah, do you know what? I'm trying to think of I suppose there's probably one very good example that we both experienced, and I'm going to sort of try and navigate my way around this. I spoke to that player since, and he's kind of, it was interesting in his perspective on it. I remember when we had Jed at Millwall, and at the time at the club, he was the main player. Now, we played a system that I think helped him flourish and got the best out of his qualities. And so therefore, I think we allowed and helped him to become that talismanic player, as well as him doing it himself with his ability. So I think it goes hand in hand. But when you build that player to that level, and you obviously, sometimes you go into a club and you have to build that player up. Sometimes you have to try and create that feeling that this player is going to be one of the main players or the main player. So that player then feels it. The other teammates feel it. So you're almost creating that situation and that scenario. And I remember Jed saying to me when he'd left to sign for West Brom, he said, I knew that you were having to let me get away with things that I probably shouldn't have got away with. And he said, and actually it's good. It's good. He said, it's good for me in a sense that I've come somewhere new and I've got to start again. And I thought that was really honest of him, because when I looked back at it, I thought you do get into a position where that type of player, whether you've built that player up for the good of a team, sometimes, I'm not say create a monster, because it wasn't a scenario like that, but sometimes then someone like Jed, could have such an influence in the way that he trained, and such an influence that if he didn't train or didn't feel good in training, that he could actually affect the group in a negative way as well. And I think that was his character was so upbeat that anything other than that would sort of worry the rest of the group, wouldn't it? And I remember Jed being out injured for a while, everyone else, you could hear people walking around going, "Oh, that's so screwed. Jed's not playing." So it is difficult. And I think as a manager, it is difficult to find that balance, because sometimes you're responsible for building the profile of a certain player. And then actually you're in a position where that becomes very difficult to manage in certain ways, because once you've allowed that, you can't start then taking things away, can you? So it was a challenge. I mean, you can remember that time, can't you, where, he could lift training. It's very few times where one player could lift training on their own, if that's their mindset on that day.
Yeah, I think one of Jed's real qualities, of course, was his enthusiasm, his infectiousness for the game when he was on it, and thankfully for us, most of the time he was. And if he came out to training and he was deciding that it was going to be a good day, it was a good day. Generally, he dragged everyone else up to the level, and, he could tell people sometimes in a very direct way, to raise their standards. But of course, players are complex, aren't they? And other things start going on, especially when it comes to contracts and towards the end of any player's contract, they start having more thoughts around, what's the future bring? And suddenly that's a weight they carry into training. And it means sometimes the talisman, it's hard for them to be everything that they were before, because they've got their own things to deal with, and they haven't got all of that energy to share with everyone else all of the time. And I think that was certainly a challenge when in that last year, trying to get him always on top form, in top form in terms of his psychology and things like that. But there was no doubt when he went out onto the pitch, he gave everything that he had, at least the majority of the time. Of course, form comes into it. But it brings me to thinking, as you say there, about Jed's time. I thought of two players I worked with previously, and both at different ends of the career. Craig Bellamy, when he was a real youngster, who would be a talisman because of his talent and his drive. And he took no prisoners from senior players or anything, but he delivered on the pitch. And everyone knew the players would accept, in a similar way to what you said about Jed, they would accept some of the things that were allowed or the player got away with, because they knew they would deliver. They were that level of talisman. They got a free pass for some things. And Dion Dublin at the other end of the scale was a talisman because he came in and he grabbed the dressing room by the scruff of the neck, and he drove standards and he pushed people. And you think they're two guys who are like 20 years apart in terms of their age when I was working with them, but equally both just absolutely not controlled the dressing room, but they had such an influence on the team that the team went, you know what, we'll run in behind these guys.
Yeah, I think Roy Keane, I might get this quote wrong, but Roy Keane said something recently, but said good teams. I think coaches hold players accountable. He said great teams, the players hold the players accountable. And I thought that was I might have got that quote slightly wrong, but I thought it was really fascinating that, when you look at that top level and when you look at, the teams that we've been involved with, when that team's performing so well, there is an element of the players control large part of those standards. And there's not many players around, like you said, that can come in and actually influence a dressing room and have the ability to influence a dressing room. We've all met players that are outspoken, and we've all met players that'll chirp up and have a go at each other. But there's very few players that can actually do it in a way that they're so well respected amongst their peers. And like you say, for staff, that can be so talismanic, can't it? That can help all of us in those ways. I think it's quite unfair at times. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on that talisman, isn't there? Thinking about, this conversation, talking about different individuals, there's a lot of pressure on those players to have to be the very best they can be every day, because they influence so many other things other than their own performance. And actually, whereas a player that probably didn't have that standing or that sort of level of quality, they can be great one day and then not so good the next day, and probably get away with it to a certain degree. I know at the high level you can't get away with that, but get away with it to a certain degree. Whereas for the talisman, everybody's looking at them. The manager, the staff, the players, the young players, everybody's looking at them. So I suppose there's a huge pressure on, like you just said, the likes of a Dion Dublin or a Craig Bellamy to be at their very best every day. And that's difficult to do, isn't it?
Yeah, especially when everything is micro-analysed nowadays. If Haaland has a bad half of a game, it's suddenly like, what's wrong with Haaland? Or any other top player in any of the teams. You're given no scope for having potentially a bad game or a slight loss in form, because we have got all these other influences outside of the game which are affecting players, and it does carry over into games. They're not robots, as has been said many times before. So when it comes to being that talisman, there's a burden, isn't there? There's a burden to have to almost show up every single time and be the best player every single time. And it transcends sports as well, doesn't it? Whether you're in the NBA, the NFL, you're in rugby, you're in football, those top performers, they're expected to deliver all the time. And maybe that's the price you pay for that level that you get to, where, yes, of course, you can be a Ballon d'Or winner, but also, probably, if you're the medical department, probably at Man City at the moment, the pressure to get Rodri back as soon as possible, to leave no stone unturned in terms of finding a way to get him back, because it's not just about whether they win the next game. It's about whether they win the league, the Champions League, the World Club Championship that's coming up this year. There's huge commercial pressures on it. So certainly when you are that player, maybe you become almost, to the point, bigger than the club.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's a sort of saying, isn't there? Pressure is a privilege. And it's hard, isn't it? I suppose when you get to that level as a player, I mean, most people don't start as a talisman, do you? You work your way to it over a career, don't you? You build, not just that quality, but those experiences that help you to go onto a pitch. I'm thinking of, when I think of a talisman, I'm thinking of people like Eric Cantona, for Man United, that just goes on the pitch. And he's probably a very good example, because, at times, he got away with some behaviour, and obviously very famously, Alex Ferguson has spoken about dealing with him differently. And maybe because of that pressure, because of that sort of burden that comes with being that type of player, maybe you have to deal with them differently. Maybe the psychology of that type of player is different to just a normal player. It's different to your everyday player. You know, I suppose in Cantona's case, it was probably a very well highlighted that he was a very different type of character. I mean, you hear stories about, people going to events and, the lads would be getting told off by Ferguson for not dressing properly, but Cantona would turn up in like trainers and, a t-shirt, and it wouldn't say anything to him because, whilst standards have to be uniformed between the team to a certain degree to create that level of what's expected from each player and not be treated so differently. I think if you're so good, even the other players at some point accept that. I mentioned Igor Stimac earlier. We accepted that as Derby players, that he was a different type of character and he was better than the players we currently had in the squad, or he was different. So you kind of accepted him being managed differently. I think that only goes so far. I don't think you can get that forever. I think that breeds a little bit of discontent by the rest of the players eventually. But I think for a small time frame, can you keep a talisman like that at your club for a long time? I suppose that's a different question, isn't it? And it's an interesting one. I'm not sure what you think, but we spoke about things where you maybe have to treat them differently. You maybe create this player, but it's unsustainable to have the player at that level for a long time for so many different reasons. Is there a time limit, do you think, on that type of player at any club?
Yeah, I think it depends how the player actually deals with their own status as talismans. Some just take it in their stride. They know they're a good player and they've got the confidence. They haven't got the arrogance that necessarily goes with it, which allows them to be able to, embed themselves in the club for many, many years, because everybody who comes in, they feel they're treated well. They know the player's a good player. They probably do all of the right things off the pitch, which show to everybody, I'm still committed to doing the work, to preparing properly, to recovering properly, that they're not just, taking every advantage they can that's being presented to them. I think if you want a longitudinal time as a talisman, you probably have to do that. If you want to be flash in the pan, you could probably come in, take everything, and move on quick, because as you say, there's only so long that people will accept it before they start to think, there's two different sets of rules going on here, and people can accept it for a short period of time. But I don't think it lasts more than a couple of years probably before it starts to become tiresome. And then you actually start driving people away from the club potentially, because they think, they want to be somewhere where everyone's created equal, but some people are more equal than others, to use the Animal Farm expression.
Bit of George Orwell. Like it. Well, I hope it was George Orwell anyway.
Yeah, more than the
I like this, mate. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think that's, it's a debate that's going to rage on forever, because I suppose football's, the beauty of football and the beauty of why people turn up to the game to watch it and pay to watch it is because they want to see these type of talisman in their team, don't they? They want to get behind, the fans want to buy, you go to certain grounds and you see the same shirt on all the kids, don't you? And you don't see many, right backs, dear. You don't see many.
It was a right back, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you know what I mean? I was using an example. You don't see many number 10s of your quality, Dave, with the shirts on.
Yeah.
But you see, but you always see that one player, don't you, that everyone seems to gravitate towards, and often they have a different persona. They just play the game with a different style and a different verve, and I suppose that's what makes football great. That's why we have to find room as managers and head coaches and heads of performers. We have to find room for these players that are maybe slightly different, that influence the team in a slightly different way. Because it would be a shame, wouldn't it, if football just became, and I know there's a danger of that, but football just became full of the same types of players. I think there always has to be room for that talismanic figure in the game. Maybe we can get our listeners to send in some of their talismans at their clubs, or, the teams they supported. Who would they see as a talisman and why, I suppose?
Well, that brings up a slight last tangent for us, which is targeting a talisman of the opposition when it comes to game day, and you know who the important players are. And sometimes, do you design a game plan which tries to influence them, expose them, take advantage of some of the things that they're not good at, while also knowing that they're very good at other things?
Well, we've mentioned Orwell, so I suppose it's a good time to mention Machiavelli, because it sounds very Machiavellian in the back of your mind. This is the ex-rugby player in you, Dave, isn't it? When you say target, I can just imagine you thinking, I'm taking that player out, I'm going to do a job on him and going to limit his importance. Of course you do. Of course you have to. Yeah, if your game plan is not designed around trying to minimise the impact of the opposition's qualities and strengths, and often that comes down to one or two players that can really affect the game in the final third, you have to think about that. I suppose the debate and the question you always have to ask yourself is, by doing that, is that taken away from my own talisman? Is that taken away from my own star players? And that's why football is such a nuanced game, is it? That's why tactics are so complex and complicated, because there's no right way to do it. I remember Neil Warnock famously said about Abdel Tarat, wasn't it, who had so much quality. He basically told his players not to give him the ball in his own half and only give it into the attacking half. And I suppose that's the ultimate that's an ultimate situation where a manager finds a way to get the best out of one player who can affect, and I think that player virtually won that team promotion that year. I'm sure there was a little bit more to it, but it's so interesting, isn't it? It's what makes a game great. And it's fascinating.
Well, there's certainly some players who are worth the ticket and the admission price alone, and those talismen are why we turn up to watch. They do the great things, don't they? And long may they continue. But until next time, next podcast, thanks guys.
Cheers, mate.